We are approaching the middle of April and now is the perfect time for me here in the UK to be starting my dahlias. Now I'm growing mine from tubers and I'll be planting them in pots before I put them in the ground around June time, and I want to give you my top 5 tips to get your dahlias off to a great start so that they don't rot in their pots and you're going to get loads of blooms come late summer. Tip number 1, don't start your dahlia tubers too early. Middle of April is the perfect time for me, but that might vary a little bit depending on where you are in the country or the world. But just remember that dahlias are a late summer into autumn flowering plant. So if you're thinking, well, if I start them, early March, maybe late February, then I might get flowers from May, June. I mean, it's good thinking, but it won't work. Dahlias flower when the days start to get shorter, so we mustn't think of them as a plant that flowers at the beginning of summer because that's not its natural instinct. If you start them really early, you're going to need warmth, like bottom heat. I'm talking about a heat mat to get them started. You're going to need grow lights, and you're going to need a lot of room because by the time it gets to the time when you can actually plant them out, they're going to be really, really big, but the chances are they'll suffer for it. They will get leggy because they won't have enough sunlight. They'll probably be malnourished from nutrients because they've been in their pot for too long, and they might have pests and they might have diseases, and they just won't be off to the best start. You want to grow them at the best time so you've got lots of strength and vigour, so that as soon as they're done in the pots they go out in the ground and they'll romp away. You've also got to bear in mind things like your last frost date, which is why you don't want to be starting them too early. Within 4 to 6 weeks of your last frost date is a great time to be starting them in a protected environment such as a polytunnel or a greenhouse, somewhere outdoors where it's bright and warm but away from frosts. Tip number 2 is to choose the correct pot size. This can be a little bit tricky when you're first starting out, but what you want to do is give the tuber a couple of inches around the tuber inside the pot so that it's got room to grow. It's not too big that it completely drowns in a pot of compost, and it's not too snug that you're forcing it into the pot. You just want to have a couple of inches around that pot for all those roots to develop, because otherwise if the pot's too small, well, it's going to dry out really quickly. Once all those roots fill the pot, it's going to run out of nutrients and it's going to get quite stressed quite quickly because it's going to want to go up into a bigger pot size or into the ground, which then just creates more work for you. And if you pot it into a pot that's far too big, well, when you're watering it, the compost is going to stay really, really wet because there aren't enough roots to absorb that moisture, which means it's more likely to rot in the pot, and that's the one big thing that you're trying to avoid. Do not want your dahlia tubers to rot, so choosing the correct pot size is one of the best ways to help prevent that. Tip number 3 involves these. Label, label, label. Say it with me. Label, label, label. If you're like me and you love growing a select colour palette, or you've got your favourite dahlias, some of them might be really, really big and need support, but some of them might be suitable for a container and you plan on putting it in a pot. You need to know which variety is which so that you can plant it in your garden, position it where you want to, give it the stakes that it requires, and without labels you're going to be struggling because they all look very, very similar. So make sure you write the variety however you wish. You can use plastic labels like this that you reuse each year. You can chop up bits of milk carton, make your own. You could write on the pot. Either way, just make sure each pot is labelled so you know exactly what you've got. Tip number 4 is to be patient. Breathe, relax, take your time, because dahlia tubers do like to take their time in appearing. Once you've got them potted and they're in your greenhouse or your polytunnel, it can take quite a few weeks for them to actually come above the surface of the soil. And in that time, you just got to be really, really patient. Some varieties will come up a lot sooner than others, and you might think, oh no, that one looks like it's not coming up, what should I do? The worst thing you could do is to change its environment by bringing it indoors or putting it someplace different or watering it more because you think it needs more water. chances are it's just a slower variety and it's still doing its thing. It's just going to be a bit further along than the ones that are already shooting. So be patient. And tip number 5 is the most important one of all. Do not overwater your freshly potted dahlia tubers. Do not overwater. Just stop it. Put down the watering can. They probably don't need it. Really, honestly, they won't. These great big fleshy tubers are made up of a lot of water and they really don't need a lot to get going. So once you've potted your dahlia tubers, you just want to give them a light watering, just enough to get the compost moist. You don't want it too soaking wet, definitely not sodden, and just be really, really careful not to overwater them, because this is the most common way that people rot their dahlia tubers. They overlove it, I get it, you know, you just want to make sure they're okay. Give them a little bit of water. That's your way of giving them a little bit of love, a little bit of TLC, checking in on them. But just put the watering can down. Ooh, it's getting a bit windy out here. Because they will rot. When they're very, very young in their pots, they do not have enough roots to absorb much moisture. You're initially just starting them off to rehydrate them, to wake them up from their winter slumber. You're just saying, hey, it's time to get up. And then once those roots start getting down, once you see that foliage coming above the surface of the soil, that's when they're going to start needing a little bit more moisture. And to check how much moisture they need, simply use your finger, stick it inside the pot. Is the compost damp? Is it soaking wet? Use your senses, look on the surface of the soil. Is there moss growing on the surface? Does it look really, really dark? That's a sign you really need to lay off the watering. But also lift up the pot. If it's really, really heavy, it probably is a bit too wet. If it's dead light, might need a little bit of a drink. But this is the most important tip if you want to get your dahlias off to a great start and for them not to die, is just lay off the watering. And that's about it. If you follow these tips, I'm sure your dahlias will be off to a fantastic start. If you want to see my more in-depth version, my full tutorial on how to pot them up, I've linked it down below because I've got a video that I shot quite a few years ago now, but it's all still totally relevant. So please do check that out and good luck with your dahlias.